Bootcamp podcast. I'm Holly Hopley, the CEO.
I'm Cheryl Ameling, the certification coordinator.
And I'm Megan Busk, the head of marketing.
And today we are excited because we're going to talk about the ARRIVE study that everybody talks about and quotes. I've seen it pop up in a lot of social media posts lately. And so I've been wanting to talk about this for a long time because I always have lots to say about induction. So I know for me personally, like when I first became a doula, I was like, inductions are stupid. Nobody needs to get induced. And I've had clients that they legit have a medical reason and they need to be induced, and they go on and they have good induction experiences, so I've kind of like grown in my, maturity as a birth professional and my thoughts about interventions and things like that. But it's still a topic that I can get excited about, I guess. So
excited.
Yeah.
My blood pressure goes up a little bit when I talk about it.
Right. Exactly. So if you are not familiar with the ARRIVE study, definitely look it up. There are tons of articles about it. There's an article on evidence-based birth about it. And so the ARRIVE study, it came out in 2018, I believe. It was right after we moved here to Utah. So about that time. So the ARRIVE study was a randomized trial, and they were looking at induction versus like that expectant management with labor starting on its own, and not just jumping to interventions and induction. So they wanted to find out if elective induction of labor, so without a medical reason, just mom's 39 weeks, let's induce you. Now, and you have to remember, this was for low risk first-time parents. And so they were looking to see if it would lower the rate of death and serious complications for babies, and if it had any effect on the risk of C-sections compared to waiting at least 40 weeks and 5 days. So they had 6,106 women that agreed to participate, and only 27% of those were found to be eligible, which I thought that number was interesting.
Yeah.
So they assigned 3,062 women to be induced at 39 weeks. And then there were 3,044 women that were in the expectant management group. Okay. So that's kind of like the basics of how that was put together.
Yeah. The overview. So let's talk about the results. So, there was no difference in infant outcomes, death or complications. Induction at 39 weeks did lower the C-section rate 19% versus 22% in the expectant management group, and the lower incidence of high blood pressure with the induction group versus the expectant management group, so 9% versus the 14%. So if you just look at that, it looks pretty like, oh, okay.
No, to me, 19 and 22, I'm like, that's not a huge difference.
It's not a huge difference.
It's small,
but it is lower.
Yeah,
it is lower,
and that's what they were. If that's what you were looking for, then that is what you got. Whether it was a lot or not, it's still technically a lower number.
Yeah,
but I agree, it's not a huge. It wasn't like it lowered it. We had 0, whatever.
Right. Or it went down to like, that 10 to 15 that the World Health Organization recommends or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it's not even as low as the World Health Organization says that it should be. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point.
That is an interesting
point.
And
I think the hard thing that we've seen kind of in practice, and kind of when we're talking to like expecting moms and pregnant people, is they just see, oh, okay, I have a lower chance of having a C-section if I'm induced at 39 weeks.
Exactly.
That's all they see. And that is what we've seen providers take. And we've seen, all right, you're 39 weeks, let's just induce you because you have a lower chance of having a C-section.
Right.
There is so much more to it than that, though. And I think that is what's missed.
Right.
So we're going to dive into all that meat. What is all that extra stuff?
Yes. Okay. So we kind of pulled out some interesting things about this study. I love the numbers too. So they said, so there were lots of numbers, 22,533 women that were eligible to participate but only 6,106 agreed to participate. That's a big difference.
That's a huge difference.
And so I think that really goes to show you that maybe like an elective induction is not something that women want.
Right.
I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think it's interesting too, because that 6,106 women were okay with being induced, which I think could potentially change the way you're going into it. It changes your mindset. It's a different mindset than, somebody who doesn't want to be induced, who then ends up being induced. Like, it's a different experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've had clients who it's like they're totally planning, low intervention birth and really wanting to avoid those things. But then maybe, their blood pressure starts to rise or whatever happens. And then we're looking at an induction. We really do have to shift.
Yeah.
And they can still have a good experience, but it takes some work, some mental work, some, to kind of like really prepare for that induction. So it is I like how you put it. It's a different mindset.
Yeah. I'll share my own experience. So I had my first two babies, just waited for them to just kind of come, and they did. And it was great. So third baby comes around, and that was my plan. I'm just going to wait until she comes. And then 40 weeks comes along. They're telling me she's big, which I'm 6'2" almost. So my babies are going to be big. That's just the nature of my life and my body. My first baby was 8 pounds, 6 ounces. My second was 9'3". So I knew it was good. She's probably going to be a big baby anyway. But at 40 weeks, they're like, okay, well, let's set an induction date. And I was like, well, is that necessary? Do I need to do that? And I hadn't done my doula training or, been with birth boot camp at that time. And so I just didn't have, I don't know, maybe the gumption to stand up for myself or the knowledge to know what I could and couldn't say no to, I guess. And so, they were like, well, let's set an induction date for 6 days from now. So 6 days rolls down, and I'm like panicking almost, like, I do not want to do this. And they're like, you're just gonna have to call and see if you can go in. So I'm calling them all day. We're not ready for you. We're not ready for you. And as the day progresses, I'm like this baby isn't coming, and I just wanted to come on its own. And like my mindset was, I was not in a good mindset. And my midwife was good to, like, I went in, she had talked to the hospital, and they were like, she doesn't want to come in today. I was like, no, I don't. My midwife was like, what's going on? I'm like, I don't really want to do this. Like, I just don't. She's like, well, why don't we plan for tomorrow? Would you feel better then? I'm like, well, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, it gives me like another day to get this baby out by myself. And at the next day I was 41 weeks. And so I was technically put on priority at the hospital. So instead of having to call all day, they were like, okay, we're scheduling you a time at 6 a.m. and you'll be there at 6 a.m. and no matter what. So I went through with it, but like, my mindset had to, like, I still don't feel like my mindset was completely there by that point. Like, it was still something that I was super intimidated about and just not terribly comfortable with. And so I can see how that would make such a huge difference. Like, if you are already like, this is what I want, and this is what I'm going to do, and at 39 weeks, I want this baby out of here. Like, I don't care how it happens. Like, then that's, then that's just going to be completely different than somebody who's like, almost, I don't want to say coerced, but like, really strongly encouraged to be induced when they're not leaning that direction. So I feel like that mindset is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I wonder if, had they not put you on the books for 6 days, if you were feeling that pressure of, I have to get this baby out, would you have gone into labor on your own if you didn't have that pressure?
Yeah,
on your
if I was more
shoulders,
relaxed.
There's so many things about that that's so unfair. And I could do a whole TED talk, but that's not today's talk. So
absolutely. I know.
But I can totally see what you're like, how that is totally different. Yeah. I think so. Something else about, the interesting part of all the meat, like Megan said, of this is like the doctors knew that they were being part of a study having to do with lowering C-section rates. So kind of knowing that you're being watched is, like you're gonna perhaps do things differently. It reminds me of when in elementary school, when the principal would come in and watch the teachers teach. The teachers taught way different that day. It was like, oh, suddenly this is a fun class, and suddenly she's telling jokes, and you're like, this isn't how it really is.
Well, and even the
know,
kids change their behavior too.
Mhm.
Speaking from a past teacher's perspective.
that's
Yeah.
right. I didn't mean to hate on you, Holly. And
Oh no,
teaching.
you're totally fine. No, I agree with you there. You're good.
But you know what I mean. Like you're gonna do things differently when you know you're being watched, and there's a specific outcome that is
that they're looking for.
That they're looking for. Exactly. Yeah.
Yep.
I feel like this was
absolutely.
one of the facts about the study that was, I don't know, probably most interesting to me, because I do feel like that makes a huge difference in the outcomes here. And
well, and we've seen this kind of happen too. There's been and I've heard about how there's hospitals like in California that are trying to reduce their C-section rate. And so they were actually posting the doctor's C-section rates, and when everybody could see them, and they were like, hey, we need to start doing things to bring them down. Of course they started to go down because these doctors were being watched. Their C-section rates were being monitored. Of course they are.
Right.
Wow, that's super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And the guidelines that take them to that, there's recommendations for failed inductions, basically. And there's certain protocols that you are supposed to be following before you jump to a C-section. And
right.
So for them to be keeping that on their mind, oh, we haven't reached hour 12, we haven't reached that point yet. They're going to keep trying. Where if they weren't being watched, then they're like, oh, you know what, this has been going on a little bit too long. Let's, let's move ahead.
Yep.
So
yeah, totally. Yeah.
So the next one, the next thing that we kind of found interesting, was that well, they just used a very specific method for the induction. And a lot of it is a lot of the providers who are kind of taking this recommendation from this study are not using the same protocols and the same methods for the induction. And so instead of following the same things that they did, they're just like, all right, show up at 6, get your Pitocin, and we'll see what happens, and so I think that in order for us to replicate it, we have to do exactly the same thing. That's what studies are for, right?
Right. Right.
So
it didn't just show that 39 weeks, inducing at 39 weeks lowers the C-section rate. It was inducing at 39 weeks in this very specific way, doing it this very specific protocol can potentially lower it. And so you can't just throw out the study and then keep doing things the way that you've been doing it that in a way that hasn't been shown to lower C-section rates. So yeah, I think that is really interesting. Just the way that, it can just be thrown out it's just a blanket statement. It's lower C-section rates when it was a way that it was done that did that.
Well, going back to the beginning, these were women who had no other health concerns.
Sure.
And so, and a lot of women who are having babies, there's just such a varying range of either health concerns or just different things that are going to take a turn when it comes to labor and delivery. So
that's a good point. Inducing somebody who's a low risk and healthy and doesn't have any things going on is different than inducing somebody who is having high blood pressure or baby's not doing well or whatever. Those are two very completely different stories. That's a really good point.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, for sure. Well, and one thing that they said about bringing that C-section rate down to 19%, where some hospitals there can vary from 32 to 60%, so, I mean, that is a a big
It's a
jump.
huge range. Yeah.
Mhm.
But you also have to think like, okay, so those hospitals that have like a 60% C-section rate, that's just what they do. That,
Mhm.
you know, like to make that shift in, okay, so if we really are going to lower the C-section rate, we have to do it this certain way. When you have a 60% C-section rate,
They would have to make so many changes.
Mhm.
yeah.
Like
Well,
to
and
me, having a C-section rate that high, to me, that's like unethical.
you're not interested in lowering
Like,
C-section rates if that's your,
Mhm.
if
that's
that's how high
just,
it is.
yeah, they have some serious policies and some serious issues at those hospitals. That's
Yeah.
kind of crazy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think so after kind of after the studies came out and a lot of people were, hearing about them, I still have people ask about them in my classes and stuff about the ARRIVE study and whether they should be induced and things like that. Some of our instructors have said they don't really hear about it, but some of them have said that they do, which I find really interesting. But we haven't seen our C-section rate go down. If anything, it's gone up. Like
Yeah.
we're not seeing any changes with this information. I think with the way that I'm hearing induction be thrown around now, it's just like, oh, I'm 39 weeks, I can be induced now. Like people think about inductions as if there's no risk at all. And I think that is, I don't know. I think almost like harming our expecting women and babies, and because we don't know a lot about the long-term risks of induction. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think that there's so much more to it that we just don't know about. I always go back to a quote that Marston Wagner said a long time ago in one of the documentaries that he was about, was in obstetrics, we have a really bad habit of just starting to do things before we have evidence or studies about them. And that's kind of what happened with Cytotec back in the 80s and 90s. They just started using it before we knew that you shouldn't use that with women who'd had a previous C-section, so they just start doing these. And I feel like that's how it is with induction, is they're yeah, this works, let's do this, but they're not looking at any long-term effects. And I think that is something that we're missing out on a lot.
Yeah.
So, but it's made to just be go in at 6 a.m. and hopefully you'll have your baby by 2 p.m. I mean, man, I wish it were that easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I feel like a lot of the things we do know about, the risks that we are aware of, are not being discussed either.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, and I know when I first became a doula, it was, like I was saying, everybody was no inductions, no, they were so bad and they increased the C-section rate and things like that. And now they're just trying to say, no, it's actually going to lower the C-section rate. And I'm like, but it's not just the induction. It's what about the risks of all the IV fluids that you receive? And then it's that cascade of interventions that happens. It's the monitoring, it's the epidural, it's all these things that are involved, that they all each have their own individual, lists of risks and benefits associated with them as well. And so I think women are just missing out on the whole picture of induction.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's also not, education isn't encouraged.
Right.
And I mean, honestly, doctors don't have time to sit there and give you the list of risks and benefits. They kind of have a way that they do things, and they expect you to follow along. And,
well, and sadly,
women,
I think,
okay.
Yeah, sadly, I think even in a lot of independent childbirth classes, outside of the hospital, a lot of them do just focus on you want to avoid intervention and you want to avoid induction. And I've heard many moms tell me this. True. I've had friends tell me this too, that they're I took this class and I just knew I didn't want an induction. I was like, okay, well, so what happens when one becomes necessary for whatever reason? And they're like, well, I had one friend who one became necessary and she's like, I just had no idea what to do. She thought her birth plan was just going to get thrown out the window. She had no idea what any of her options are. And that's one thing I love about what we teach in birth boot camp. especially in our comprehensive class, is like, you know what? Okay, so if you do need to have one, these are questions to be asking. These are things to consider. These are, this is how your birth plan might need to be, tweaked a little bit, just to like give them some tools so that there's, not this trauma surrounding this induction that they were not planning to have.
Yeah.
So
I love that you brought that up, because I've seen that as well, where women are seeing this picture perfect idea of what their birth class is telling them can happen when they do this certain technique, and then they get into labor and it's maybe more challenging than they thought, or certain things happen and they may need to be induced, like you're saying, and they just feel like they failed, like they didn't do it right. And
I hate
that's
that.
why. Yeah, me too. It's just like almost, it like is heartbreaking for me when I talk to a mom and she's like, what did I do wrong? And you didn't do anything wrong. You just weren't given the right tools that you needed.
Yes. Okay. So that, I was going to say there's a quote. So, Cheryl and I have been preparing our presentation for DoulaCon this week. And so we've been doing lots of research and reading. And I have been reading on Dr. Sarah Wickham's website. She's a researcher and a speaker and an author. She has lots of books that I want to read. I haven't read her books yet, but I want to. And so she talks a lot about induction. And let me see if I can find it. Oh, she has an article called 10 Things I Wish Every Woman Knew About Induction. And she just wrote it last fall. So just not quite a year ago. And one of the things on there, I read it and I was like, oh, this is so good. I want to quote it the right way. I don't want to say it. So she says, women don't fail, inductions and systems do.
Yeah.
I like that.
And I was like, yep, absolutely.
That little fire is going on inside. I'm like, yes.
Yep.
It gets me riled up, man.
So I want to talk about, like they did this study because they want to lower the C-section rate. And they were, looking at the specific type of induction. But I'm like, we already know that there are a million other things that we can do to lower the C-section rate. And I think that they're easier things than like their induction. Things that are more realistic, they're easier for women and birth professionals to help with.
And cost effective.
Yes. Yes. Cost effective.
Yeah.
I mean, even having a doula, like there have been studies that shown that when you have a doula, you are less likely to have a C-section. So we need more doulas. And a lot of people say, oh, my area is saturated with doulas. No, they aren't. Like there are 10,000 babies born across the United States every day. Like if we could work together to educate the public more about doulas, more people would be hiring us and like we'd all be booked. So, but just having a doula is going to lower your chance of having a C-section.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Intermittent monitoring versus continuous monitoring. You're 39% less likely to have a C-section with intermittent monitoring. And we talk about this in class. But, there's the lack of movement available, even if they're like, you can move with it on, you're tethered to a monitor. There are like the wireless monitors and things like that, that are helpful. Not always available.
If you need it.
Yeah. Yes. If you need it. Right. But I think it's interesting that when the continuous monitoring was first developed, they thought it was going to like save all these babies' lives. And what we found is that our baby saving rate has stayed the same and our C-section rate has gone up. And so it's not proven to help anything except to give more C-sections. So you're 39% less likely to have a cesarean with intermittent monitoring compared to continuous monitoring.
Yeah.
And that's one of those things from personal experience, I feel like you have to fight for. I've asked for like intermittent monitoring for all three of my kids, and I was not given that. So it's something that I was asked for, and they're like, well, let's just keep it on for a little bit. And then it was, let's keep it on for longer and longer and longer. And then it was just the whole time. So it's definitely something like, especially, I don't know, talking to your care provider beforehand and just getting an idea of what they're willing to fight for, or let you do, and looking out for those I guess, red flags.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. Well, and I always talk about too of every hospital and every provider, intermittent monitoring means something different to them.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so finding out what that looks like, and so I definitely recommend talking to your provider before the big day.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And finding out the policies, because the doctor will say, the doctor could say one thing, but the policies at the hospital that the nurse has to uphold could be something different. So
that's a really good point. And it varies from nurse to nurse.
Exactly. Those don't always line up, which then again makes it more challenging. Like, well, then how do I speak up? How do I fight for what I want? So finding out the policies, and then, if it's available, changing if the policy does not match your desires, is there some other place that would more closely match what you're wanting? And I know that's not always possible, but it is an option sometimes.
Being aware.
Exactly.
I feel like another thing that helps lower C-section rates is looking at midwifery care. Out of hospital births have a 5 to 6% C-section rate, with the in-hospital births, as we've seen, can be up to 60%. So just being aware of what those numbers are, like 5 to 6% is right. Like that's just amazing.
I know every year when I see midwives and birth centers posting their like C-section rate, and I'm like how can theirs be so low and the others are so high?
Well, to be fair,
this huge discrepancy.
To be fair, they only see low risk.
That's true. I do have to remember my.
So I feel like that, but still, I mean, your point it's still valid.
Yeah.
But that is one.
Yeah. I know. I always have to remind myself, like, especially like if you're seeing an MFM, I'm like, their C-section rate's going to be higher because they're seeing high risk patients.
Exactly.
And things like that. But it's just like.
It's still a huge difference regardless.
It's just huge. It's just huge.
But if you look at the study, the women were all low risk, and they were at 19%,
Yeah. True.
And I think that it's interesting that they can get that 5 to 6% without needing to routinely
induce. Yeah.
Like the study showed that we got that lower C-section rate when we induced. They get a lower C-section rate without inducing, and the same population, the low risk women.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're going to talk about this later. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're fine. Go.
But there is shown that hospitals that have midwives, so certified nurse midwives who are at the hospital helping deliver babies, they also have a lower C-section rate, even just their presence at the hospital. So I feel like that's interesting to note as well.
Yeah, definitely. Sure. Yeah. I think a lot of people just also don't have an understanding of like basic comfort measures, and that it is good to be up and moving and in upright positions and things like that. And I think that I wonder if we have, I mean, I don't know if this would affect our C-section rate, but I think that a majority of us kind of live more of a sedentary lifestyle. And I think that is kind of leading to more like malpositioned babies and things like that, because like we see so many people out there talking about like all these exercises you can do to get your baby into a better position. And I'm like, I think if we were all just up and walking more and not sitting, not reclining, not coming home and like laying on the couch watching Netflix. And I think if women understood more about how like their posture can affect the baby's position and things like that, like I almost wonder if we would see less malposition issues, and that would lower our C-section rate. I don't know. But then just like sharing with women that like be upright in your labor, be walking, be on hands and knees, sit on the ball. Like TV just makes us think, oh, you just get in the bed and lay in the bed. And that's what they're inclined to do.
Yeah.
Well, and it comes to training as well. I mean, midwives train for that. Midwives learn all of that, where like OBs, they're focused on the medical aspects of it all. And I don't know what their training is. I'm not a trained OB, but I assume that their training isn't like, what are all the homeopathic ways or the natural ways that we can get this baby out?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
I just finished reading Labor Pain by Hensi Goer. Highly recommend. It's the shortest read. It's so good. Everybody go buy it right now. But she calls it DIY strategies. And, so like getting in the bath or hip squeezes or counter pressure or, like things we can do, they're things that you have to learn. You have to know what the DIY strategies are. But I thought that was kind of a cute way of like we have epidurals, we have nitrous, we have, like all these different things that we can do to take the pain away. But there are also strategies that we can do that don't have any risks. Using a tennis ball on your back, 0 risk. If you don't like it anymore, don't do it anymore. It hurts,
Right.
don't do it. Massage, like all these different strategies that when they're identified, like when you take a class and you say like, oh yeah, massage does feel really good when my shoulders are tense. You could also do that in labor. So it's like identifying these things and also learning new skills. Like taking a bath. That feels so good at the end of a stressful day. That's a DIY strategy. And so I liked the way that she talked about it. But yeah, like you said, like those, like learning those comfort measures, things that we can do that have 0 risks and can really, maybe not, they're not going to take all the pain away, but it can comfort you. It can help with the pain and just that support, like that solid support of a person being next to you, going back to that doula, how doulas can lower C-section rates, having that solid support person, like all of it works together to lower that C-section rate.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I keep thinking, so, well, in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of articles talking about the ARRIVE study. And there have been studies going on that still show that there's an increase of C-section with induction. Again, Dr. Sarah Wickham's website, she's been talking about that. And just in the past year, there have been studies that when they're just looking at a group of women, induced and not induced, the ones that are induced have more C-sections.
Okay.
So I don't know. So it's just like this.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just like, I don't know what to do with this information anymore with the ARRIVE study. Like, they're not following the same policies and procedures. They're not, and we're not getting the same results, which makes sense. So, there was a letter from the American College of Nurse Midwives, and they pointed out in another study, they reported that 14 women, if they had continuous labor support, they would be able to prevent 1 C-section. Which I thought those were decent numbers. But the ARRIVE study showed that 28 women had to have that elective induction to prevent 1 C-section.
So it's back to our doula support.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's so interesting. And like you said, like we still don't even know the long-term effects of this. And, so to be, I don't know, it kind of makes me crazy that we just, like you said earlier, like we don't know the effects of all these things that we do. And we just sort of do them anyway.
Right. Yeah. We learn like after the fact.
Yeah. On babies, on women. It's probably going to be okay, right? I don't know. We don't know.
Right.
That's the concerning part of this whole thing.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I think. Well, and I think it's so hard too because ACOG went and they, now on their like stuff, they say, low risk first time moms can be induced at 39 weeks. So like they changed what they said based off of this study.
But they go on to say other things too. But if you just take that, then yeah, you can just run with it.
Yeah.
Because they encourage care providers to consider like the protocols and the realities of their specific hospital, like where you work, can you do this? So like so I think that they said that is a little, that they said that it does, it's reasonable to offer the elective induction. You're kind of like, oh, come on, guys, seriously. And so you can just leave it like that. Like a doctor could just read that and be like, oh, that's what ACOG says. But you have to like go on and consider other things, and kind of, I mean, even for like Megan, where she said like, is the mom wanting to wait for labor to start on her own? That's a very different thing than somebody who's like, I'm 39 weeks, please get this baby out of me,
Right.
Like it's very, very different. If she's hoping for an unmedicated birth, you're more likely to end up with an epidural with an induction. So there are things to consider about the specific woman and her birth plan, rather than just saying, everybody, the lower C-section rates, we should just do that with everybody. It's just very different.
Well, it also takes into account like what their staffing and hospital situation is like. In the study, it shows that women who were induced at that 39 weeks went a lot longer during labor at the hospital. And that time is money as well for the hospitals and for their staff. So
yeah, that's such a good point.
Yep. Well, and I always go back to, how people think they go in at 6 and they'll have their baby by like 2 p.m. And maybe you will. I've seen it happen.
It does happen.
It happened to my sister. Like, it does happen.
Right.
But so like ACOG also has like their protocol for that failed induction. Remember the induction failed. So, but they're saying early labor can last 24 hours or more, as long as there's no complications. And that's why I'm always like, is mom healthy? Is baby healthy?
Right.
Like, is everybody doing okay? And then Pitocin can be given for 12 to 18 hours after breaking the mother's water before the induction is considered a failure. Like, I don't feel like I have ever seen those numbers be like, those are big numbers to me.
Those are because
I feel like most of the time they're like, oh, it's been 6 hours and nothing's really happening, so we're just gonna do it. We're just gonna do a C-section, and it's failed. I don't feel like most women are given that much time.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Yeah. So well, it seems like, no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, in our study, as we've talked about, like they were watched, so these numbers were followed pretty strictly.
Right.
Yeah.
Like you just like patience. And that's, I think that's one thing about midwifery care is that you hear a lot is like, you want a care provider that can just sit on their hands. They're in the corner.
Patience in general. I just think patience in general, those last couple of weeks of pregnancy, like you will not be pregnant forever. And I think that we just have, I think there's just so much pressure on women, and everybody around 38, 39 weeks, they're like, have they scheduled your induction yet? Have they like, how do we normalize not being induced?
Right.
Because there are risks associated, and like, that's not always what's best for mom and baby. And your due date is just a guess. You know what? So there's just so much pressure on that. So, I don't know. And how do we like get more people in classes so they're learning all of these things? Like, these are the problems we're trying to solve, right?
Yes.
So yeah, how do we get women to question this more? How do we get them to like talk to their care provider about these things more and really like analyze these things? Like, am I healthy? Is my baby healthy? Is there a reason we're messing with these things? Like, our bodies are meant to do this. And
and there's a time and a place, like you've started out saying.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, I think we've said all of this, but the having in-depth conversations with your care provider, knowing the policies that of your birthplace, like those things are huge. Like, what are your chances of ending up being induced? Are you okay with that? Are you not? Do you understand the risks if you are? What happens if it becomes necessary? Like these are conversations to have and to keep asking questions about. I think sometimes I've had students who go and, they talk to their care provider. How often do you induce? Well, not that often. Okay. And then that's the end of the conversation. You're like, no. Keep talking about it. Keep asking. Like, there's so many more questions
Yeah.
to know the answers to. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think along with that, like taking a class so you know what questions to ask, and hiring a doula so you can have additional support there, and finding ways to advocate for yourself. You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And kind of taking your healthcare into your own hands. This is your birth, and you've hired this care provider to make sure that the baby gets out safely. But ultimately, this is your experience and your baby and your body. And, Megan, I hate that you didn't feel like you had like autonomy to say like, no, this is my body and I'm calling the shots, like it's so common, like, and women are just like, yeah, okay, and
well, we all hear that phrase of like, I'm just going to listen to my doctor. They know more than I do.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. They learned a lot of stuff from medical books, but they don't know you, like your body and your, like your thoughts and your feelings and your opinions. And like, they know what they learned in textbooks.
Right. Yeah.
And like from their experience, basically, Yeah. But you are an individual
Which is
person.
Valuable. All of that is valuable.
Yeah.
But continue what you were going to say.
Oh, I was just going to say, they just don't, like, your birth is different than anybody else's.
Right.
No two births are the same. And they try to put us all in this cookie cutter thing, of this is how your birth should go. And this is how we're going to try to control it with all these, high tech medical things. And it's not how it's meant to work.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They're not an expert on you.
And
only you are.
Yeah.
Well, and they're not all knowing either.
Right.
So,
Exactly.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's so true.
Well,
this was really good.
This was good.
This was
I'm
good.
I think we can keep going. We can talk about induction.
Yeah.
And just all of this in general.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I know, it spurred so many things. I'm like, we need to talk more about that. We need to talk more about that.
Yeah,
exactly. How to stay on focused.
Yep.
Stay on topic.
I know. My list of TED Talks I have.
Just we need to create like a birth TED Talk type platform.
Yep, exactly.
Although that's what our classes are for.
That's right.
All right. Well, this was fun, guys.
It was
good to kind of pick all this stuff apart and and look at it from different angles, I think is important. So, all right. Well, if you have any thoughts about like induction or the Arrive study, feel free to send us a message or comment. I'm always super curious to hear what like people see with it in their specific area, and things like that. So, all right. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. Be sure to subscribe, leave us a review if you would like, and we'll talk to you next week.